Right, so, Regular Show. A cartoon that aired on Cartoon Network in the afternoon, aimed at children, about two 23-year-olds, with no ambition, no money, and no real plan, who work at a park and mostly try not to. And somehow, tucked into that, you've got references to Judge Dredd, Blade Runner, Big Trouble in Little China, a Devo frontman writing the music, and a condom wrapper that sat on screen for a few frames, before somebody at the network noticed and quietly scrubbed it out of every rerun forever. I've been going back through it recently, partly because the show came back in 2026 after 9 years away, and partly because I'd forgotten how much of it was built out of stuff nobody was supposed to catch. So that's what this is. 100 of them. Origins, voices, music, cutscenes, background jokes you'd need to pause to see. No particular order to it. No big finish. You can drift off wherever you like, and you won't miss anything. If you're enjoying these, a subscribe helps more than you'd think. Let's get into it. The thing I love about Regular Show's origins is that the show basically already existed before anyone thought to make it. Not as a pitch, not as a Bible full of character breakdowns. It existed as two student films that a bloke made at art school, mostly for a laugh, and a couple of characters he liked enough to keep. The first one is called The Naive Man from Lollyland. J.G. Quintel made it at CalArts in 2005, and it stars a very polite, very sheltered man with a lollipop for a head, who comes from a place where lollipops are the currency. If that sounds familiar, it should. That's Pops, the exact same character, more or less fully formed, years before the park existed. The short did well too, picking up 2 awards at the Nicktoons Film Festival that year, which is a decent result for a student project. The second one is called 2 in the AM PM, and it's a very different animal. Made in 2006, it's about 2 blokes working the night shift at a petrol station convenience store on Halloween. One of them offers the other a sweet. The sweet turns out to be laced, and the rest of the film is the 2 of them hallucinating. Among the hallucinations, a blue jay and a gumball machine. That's Mordecai and Benson, their first ever appearance and their drug visions in a short film that is absolutely, unambiguously not for children. I find that genuinely funny. 2 of the most recognisable characters in 2010's cartoons started life as an acid trip in a petrol station. And here's the detail that makes it better. Quintel voiced the clerk in that short. Sam Marin voiced the other one. So when the show got picked up years later, the voices were already locked in Quintel's head, because he'd been hearing them since art school. That's why Benson sounds like Benson from episode 1. That casting wasn't a decision, so much as a leftover. Now both of these shorts came out of a game the CalArts lot used to play, called 48-hour films. The setup was simple. Everybody chucks a word into a hat, you pull one out at midnight, and you've got the weekend to make a cartoon out of it. That's it. No brief, no notes, no client. Just a word in 2 days. Which explains a lot about the show, honestly. Regular Show at its best has that exact energy. Someone had one stupid idea on a Friday and just committed to it completely. Rock, paper, scissors, escalating into a hole in the universe. That's a 48-hour film instinct that survived into a professional writer's room. When it came time to actually pitch the thing to Cartoon Network in 2008, Quintel didn't do a verbal pitch. He storyboarded the entire short and showed them that instead. His reasoning was pretty sensible. Try describing this show out loud. A blue jay and a raccoon work at a park with a gumball machine, a yeti, and a man with a lollipop for a head. Nobody's buying that in a meeting room. You have to show them. Here's one that always gets me though. The show was originally going to be called Normal Show. Just Normal Show. And I know it's only one word off, but it's completely different, isn't it? Normal Show sounds like a description. Regular Show sounds like a joke you're being let in on. The other thing worth knowing is where it came from institutionally, because it very nearly didn't happen at all. Regular Show was born out of a Cartoon Network program called the Cartoon Institute, which was this artist-driven initiative to make loads of short pilots and see what stuck. They planned 39 shorts. They got 14 made before the network pulled the plug on the whole thing. Quintel's was one of the 14. If they'd cancelled it a bit earlier, or if his had been slotted a bit later in the queue, we simply don't have this show. That's a genuinely thin margin. Now let's talk a little about Rigby, because his origin is the most casual thing imaginable. Quintel drew a raccoon hula hooping. That's it. He liked the drawing, kept it, and built a character around it who'd be significantly less responsible than the blue jay. No deeper story than that. Somebody doodled a raccoon with a hula hoop, and it turned into one half of the most quoted friendship on Cartoon Network. Mordecai, on the other hand, is Quintel. He said as much repeatedly. Mordecai is basically him during his college years. That stretch where you're hanging around with your mates getting into daft situations, but also sort of taking it seriously. And this is why Quintel voices him in his own normal speaking voice, with no character work on top. It's also why, and this is the bit I never noticed until it was pointed out, Mordecai never once acts like a bird. He's got wings. He does not use them for bird things. He's a bloke. There's one more origin fact that I think is the best of the lot, and it's the version of the show that doesn't exist. The original setup Quintel wanted was Mordecai and Rigby working at a zoo full of humans, so the animals are the staff, and the exhibits are people. He was apparently very set on it. The higher-up said no, and he's since said he reckons they were right, and the park was the better call. I'm inclined to agree, but I'd have watched the zoo one. And here's a small detail that connects all of this back to the actual series. In the episode Benson Be Gone, there's a moment where Susan rotates her head and flies out of the house. That specific shot is taken from 2 in the AM/PM. It's a bit of animation from Quintel's NSFW student short, reused in a children's cartoon on daytime telly, and I'd wager almost nobody watching clocked it. That's the pattern with this show, really. It was never really scrubbed clean of where it came from. The student films are still in there, sitting just under the surface, and every so often one of them pokes through. And since we're on the subject of things that survived from the shorts, it's worth saying how unusual that actually is. Most shows get developed to death. A pitch goes in, a network gives notes, characters get softened, designs get rounded off, and by the time it reaches air, the thing barely resembles what the creator originally drew. Benson is the same gumball machine from the petrol station short. Pops is the same lollipop man from Lollyland. Mordecai is the same blue jay. Sam Marin's voice for Benson is the voice he did as a favour for a mate's student film. Almost nothing got sanded down between the art school version and the broadcast version, which is genuinely rare. The one exception, and it's a big one, is tone. 2 in the AM/PM is not a children's cartoon in any sense. There's language in it that would never get near daytime telly. There's a fair bit of nudity, and the whole premise is 2 lads accidentally taking acid at work. It plays like the adult version of regular show that people have always speculated about, except it existed first. There's a small detail I like about that short as well. The design used for the clerk who looks like Quintel eventually got repurposed years later as Josh in Close Enough, his HBO Max series. So that one drawing has now been in 3 separate projects, across nearly 20 years. The naive man from Lollyland got a slightly odd afterlife too. It was included as an extra on one of the regular show DVD releases, which is a nice gesture, except it went out with a couple of censors applied. The waiter's line, "What the hell," got muted except for the first word. And the music over the intro and credits was muted as well, most likely because nobody had cleared the rights for a home video release. So the student film that gave us Pops is available on DVD in a slightly worse condition than the version that won awards. One more thing about the pitch, because it explains the show's shape. Quintel has described the setup he had to sell as a blue jay and a raccoon who work at a park with a gumball machine, a yeti, and a bloke with a lollipop for a head. Read that back. There is no version of that sentence that sounds like a good idea. It doesn't have a hook. It doesn't have a premise. It doesn't tell you what happens. It's a list of nouns, which is precisely why the storyboard mattered. Once you see it moving, once you see the deadpan delivery, and the way the surreal stuff arrives without any fanfare, the whole thing clicks instantly. It's a show that cannot be explained and can only be demonstrated, and Quintel understood that going in. The other bit of background worth knowing is where he'd been working before. He was a storyboard revisionist on Camp Laszlo, then creative director on the marvellous misadventures of Flapjack. And Flapjack is a really important stepping stone here, because it was a genuinely strange show with a lot of unusual talent passing through it. A fair chunk of the people who'd go on to define Cartoon Network for the next decade came out of that building. If you've watched Flapjack, you can see the DNA. That willingness to let a scene get genuinely uncomfortable, the sudden shifts in animation style, the sense that anything could happen and nobody would acknowledge it. Regular Show is a much more restrained show on the surface, but the machinery underneath is the same. There's one last detail from the Cal Arts years that I think is my favourite. Quintel grew up in Hanford, California, which by his own account was a fairly boring place to be a teenager. He and his mates had to entertain themselves, and a lot of those experiences ended up feeding directly into episodes, which is, when you think about it, the entire premise of the show. Two lads in a place where nothing happens, inventing things to do, and having it get out of hand. The park isn't a fantasy setting, it's a small town in California with the boredom turned into monsters. Let's talk about Mark Hamill for a bit, because his involvement in this show is one of those things that sounds like a rumour and isn't. Hamill voices Skips, the immortal yeti who fixes everything and has seen it all before. And it's a lovely performance, low, flat, completely unbothered, the vocal equivalent of a bloke who's been alive since the 1700s and cannot be surprised anymore. But he didn't audition for Skips, he auditioned for Pops. Sam Marin already had the part, so Quintel just had Hamill read for Skips instead, and that's how we ended up with what we ended up with. I've thought about Hamill's Pops a fair bit since I learned this, and I genuinely cannot picture it. Pops needs that specific, fragile, delighted Edwardian quality. Hamill would have made a fascinating meal of it, but I don't think it's the same show. Speaking of Sam Marin, this is where it gets slightly absurd. Marin voices Benson. He also voices Pops. He also voices Muscle Man, 3 of the 7 main characters. A shouting gumball machine, a gentle lollipop aristocrat, and a green bloke who won't stop talking about his mum. Same person. And they don't sound related in any way. That's not a small bit of range. Quintel does the same trick on a smaller scale. He voices Mordecai and High Five Ghost, which is normally invisible because Fives barely speaks. But there's an episode where Mordecai gets hit in the crotch by a game show obstacle, and the noise he makes is unmistakably High Five Ghost. It's not a joke, it's just what happens when the same throat produces both characters and one of them gets caught off guard. High Five Ghost wasn't always Quintel's, mind you. His first 2 appearances were voiced by Jeff Bennett, a very established voice actor, before Quintel took the role over. Nobody's ever properly explained why. Both of them were still working on the show. It just changed, and nobody made a fuss. Eileen's casting is my favourite one in the whole show. Minty Lewis wasn't a voice actor. She was a writer and storyboard artist on staff. She wrote the line about the baby sea turtle eggs in Do Me a Solid, and when she pitched it out loud in the room, that was it. Everyone realised she was Eileen. She didn't audition, she just read her own joke correctly and got a main cast role out of it. Now let's talk about the guest casting, because whoever was doing it had a real sense of humour about it. In Meet Your Maker, the villains are a group of anthropomorphic hot dogs. He's voiced by Tim Curry, which is funny on its own, but the deeper layer is that Curry is best known as Dr. Frankenfurter in the Rocky Horror Picture Show and the entire song Meatloaf Again business. And now, here he is playing sentient processed meat, trying to kill 2 blokes. Nobody in the episode acknowledges it. It's just there for the people who'd get it. Then there's Fortune Cookie, where Benson gambles the park away to an evil sorcerer. The sorcerer is drawn to look almost exactly like David Lopan from Big Trouble in Little China, and the part is voiced by James Hong, who played David Lopan. That's not a reference anymore. That's just hiring the actual bloke. There's a run of Community casting too, which I only noticed on a rewatch. Joel McHale, Yvette Nicole Brown, Donald Glover, and Gillian Jacobs all turn up across the series, and some of them are in the same episode. Around 2012 or so, Community and Regular Show had a genuinely overlapping audience. People in their 20s watching a kids' cartoon and a network sitcom about a study group, both of which were slightly too clever for their slot. Roger Craig Smith is the one who does the most heavy lifting nobody notices. He voices Thomas, the perpetually abused intern who joins in season 4. He also voices Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr. Completely different registers, same bloke. There's a fan observation about Smith that I'll pass on, with the caveat that nobody official has ever confirmed it. Thomas and Sonic the Hedgehog have very similar shoes. Smith voiced Sonic for years. People have decided this is deliberate. It might just be that red and white trainers are a common design. I lean towards coincidence, but I'd be pleased to be wrong. Mordecai's parents got quietly recast, which is one of those things that only registers if you watch the episodes close together. In the Thanksgiving special, they're voiced by Jennifer Hale and Alistair Duncan. Then, in Maxin' and Relaxin', the episode that actually properly focuses on them, they're Katie Sagal and Ed Begley Jr. Both perfectly good pairings, but the swap suggests somebody decided the parents needed a different flavour once they became real characters, rather than holiday background. Here's a small one I like. Paul F. Tompkins voices the were-skunk in Skunked. Janie Haddad voices Margaret. Tompkins and Haddad are married. So somewhere in the credits of a Cartoon Network show about a park, there's a married couple where one of them is a coffee shop waitress and the other is a skunk werewolf. And then Carl Weathers turns up as the god of basketball. Carl Weathers, who was a professional American football player before he was Apollo Creed, cast as the deity of the wrong sport. I don't know if that was intentional, but it's very funny either way. The last thing on voices, and it's the one that explains a lot about how the show sounds. Hamill confirmed that the cast typically recorded together in the same room at the same time. That's not standard for animation. Most of the time, actors record alone, in a booth, reading their lines into silence while a director feeds them cues. It's cheaper and easier to schedule, but it means the performances get stitched together afterwards, rather than genuinely happening. Regular Show doesn't sound like that. The overlaps, the interruptions, the way Rigby's whining collides with Mordecai's sighing, that's two people in a room actually talking to each other. It's a big part of why the show feels loose and lived in rather than assembled, and it's probably the single most underrated production decision they made. There's one more thing about the voice work that I think gets missed, and it's about restraint rather than range. The performances on this show are remarkably low-key by animation standards. Most cartoon voice acting is pitched up, bigger, brighter, more energy, because it has to carry over the animation. Regular Show does the opposite. Mordecai and Rigby mostly sound bored, or mildly annoyed, or half asleep, which is exactly how two 23-year-olds sound at work. Quintel has said he's so naturally relaxed that when it came to voicing Mordecai in the film, he had to actually practice shouting. He doesn't raise his voice much in real life, which means every time Mordecai genuinely loses it, that's a bloke doing something he finds physically uncomfortable. William Salyers deserves a mention here too, because Rigby is a much harder performance than it looks. That voice is scratchy and high and pushed right to the edge, and he did it for 7 years across 244 episodes without it going anywhere. Rigby's stop talking is one of those line readings that people can do an impression of 15 years later, which is the sign of a genuinely great vocal character. There's also a fair bit of doubling up beyond the main cast that goes unremarked. Quintel, Salyers and Hamill all voice a stack of background characters between them. If you're listening for it in a crowd scene, you'll hear the same 3 blokes doing 4 or 5 different people, which was presumably cheaper and also just easier when everyone's already in the room. Courtney Taylor voices both the angry lady and the cake shop worker in Take the Cake, which is the same trick on a smaller scale. Roger Craig Smith gets a proper name gag as well. He voices a character called Frank Smith, which is either a coincidence or somebody in casting having a quiet laugh. The other thing I find interesting about the casting is the sheer weight of it in retrospect. Mark Hamill was doing this the same decade he was back in Star Wars. Tim Curry, James Hong, Carl Weathers, Katie Sagal, Ed Begley Jr. That's a proper roster for a show that aired at 8:15 on a Monday. And none of them are used as stunt casting. Nobody's introduced with a fanfare. Hamill isn't playing Mark Hamill as a Yeti. He's playing a groundskeeper who moves by skipping. The show never once winks about who's in it. I think that's part of why the voice work holds up so well. There's no showing off. Even with a cast that deep, the register stays flat and conversational, which is why the surreal stuff lands so hard when it arrives. Everyone's reacting to a demon like it's a paperwork problem. There's one specific thing about the show's naming that I only clocked recently, and it's a small joke about the cast list itself. The main 7 are split almost exactly down the middle between ordinary names and nonsense. Mordecai, Benson and Rigby on one side, Pops, Skips and High Five Ghost on the other. Muscle Man sits in between because he's mostly a nickname, but his actual name is Mitch. And Mordecai, Benson and Rigby aren't just ordinary names. They're specifically names that were uncommon and relatively rare in the early 20th century. Slightly old-fashioned, which gives the whole thing a faintly out-of-time quality that matches the anachronistic technology and the 80s music. Then there's Thomas, whose real name turns out to be Nikolai, which is a joke that only works because Thomas is such a plain name to begin with. There are actually 2 Thomases in the show, the intern and Death's son. Rigby points this out in the episode where Mordecai and CJ have to babysit the latter, which is the sort of small housekeeping gag that most shows wouldn't bother with. Here's something you've experienced hundreds of times without ever noticing. Regular show doesn't have a theme song. It doesn't have an opening at all, really. What it has is a single distorted low note with a filter on it that gradually opens up, and then the episode starts. That's the whole thing. In a landscape where every other Cartoon Network show had a proper sung title sequence with a name check of every character, this one just makes a noise at you and gets on with it. The bit everyone thinks of as the theme is actually the end credits music, and it's tiny, 28 notes, about 11 seconds long. That's it. That's the whole cue, and it's so distinctive that people can hum it decades later despite it being shorter than most ringtones. It was written by Mark Mothersbaugh, who, and this is one of those facts that reframes everything, is the frontman of Devo. The bloke who sang Whip It scored a cartoon about park groundskeepers. He also did the score for the whole series, not just the sting, and over the run there were 5 separate extended versions of that end theme. There's a small oddity in how it's used too. 4 of the 11-minute episodes skip it entirely. Caffeinated concert tickets, prank callers, Mordecai and the Rigbys, and Brain Eraser. Those all end on something musical, or something that needed its own note to land on, so the standard cue would have stepped on it. It's a small bit of discipline that most shows wouldn't bother with. Now, licensed music. Regular Show was only the second show in Cartoon Network's history to use licensed songs. The first was Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi, which is a sentence I did not expect to be typing. And once you know that, you realise how much of the show's identity rides on it. The needle drops are doing enormous work. That's not filler, that's the entire emotional register of certain episodes. And it was apparently rare enough at the network to count as a proper break with how things were done. Right, Here's my favourite music fact in the whole series, and it's an odd one. In the episode More Smarter, Rigby dreams about solving the hardest maths problem in the world. The scene is lifted almost shot for shot from Rushmore, down to the music underneath it. Mothersbaugh scored Rushmore. So Mark Mothersbaugh had to sit down and write a knockoff of his own composition for a cartoon, so it would sound like the thing he'd already written, but legally distinct from it. I think about that more than is reasonable. That episode's got another one in it too. One of the answers in Rigby's crossword is Algernon, which is a nod to Flowers for Algernon, a story about someone getting artificially clever and then losing it again, which is exactly the plot of the episode. That's a solid gag hidden in a background prop. And Rushmore keeps coming back, because Quintel has cited it as his favourite film. In Replaced, the two hipsters who briefly nick Mordecai and Rigby's jobs are called Chad and Jeremy. Chad and Jeremy were a real 60s folk duo, and their song, A Summer Song, appears in Rushmore. So you've got a Rushmore reference disguised as a hipster joke, disguised as two blokes' names. That's 3 layers deep for something that's on screen for a few minutes. There's a run of song-based titles and lines scattered through the series too, and they're all from a very specific era. Stake Me Amadeus takes its name from Falco's 1984 chart topper, Rock Me Amadeus. Pops, at one point, arrives at Skip's house to play a drawing game and announces, "I got my pencil, give me something to write on," which is a line from Van Halen's Hot for Teacher. Muscle Man, throwing things into a deep fryer at a party, says, "It's my party and I'll fry if I want to," which is Leslie Gore. None of these are flagged. Nobody reacts. They're just in there for whoever's listening properly. Then there's 150 Drum Kit, which I'd argue is the most specifically nerdy piece of music writing in the show. Benson gets a rotating drum solo, and the rig itself is straight out of Mötley Crüe. That's a Tommy Lee spinning kit. But the actual playing style is much more Neil Peart of Rush. Polyrhythmic, a marimba break in the middle, finished off with a gong. So visually, it's Tommy Lee. Musically, it's Neil Peart, and it's happening to a gumball machine. That's a level of detail nobody demanded. And one more, for the sake of completeness. In Video Game Wizards, the characters in the game that one of the girls is playing are dressed as Devo, red energy domes and everything, which means somewhere in the production, someone put a tiny animated tribute to the composer into the background of a video game episode. Whether Mothersbaugh ever noticed, I've got no idea. I'd like to think he did. That's the thing about the music on this show. It's doing more than it's letting on, constantly. There's no theme song to tell you what to feel, so everything has to be earned by the score, or by a song choice, and both of those are being made by people who are showing off slightly, in a good way. There's a broader point buried in all this, which is that the music is carrying an enormous amount of the show's identity, precisely because the visuals are so restrained. Regular show looks quite plain a lot of the time. Flat colours, simple backgrounds, a park that's mostly grass and a house. The animation is expressive, but it isn't lavish. So when an episode needs to feel enormous, a fight in space, a car chase, a moment of genuine sadness, the score has to do the lifting, because the picture isn't going to. And Mothersbaugh is unusually good at that specific job. His work has this quality of being slightly synthetic and slightly warm at the same time, which is exactly right for a show about people in their 20s being nostalgic for a decade they were barely alive for. The licensed tracks are chosen with the same instinct. They're rarely the obvious hit. They're the song that was on in the background at somebody's house, which is a much more specific kind of nostalgia and a much harder one to fake. While we're here, there's a whole seam of 80s rock running through the show at the character level too. Mordecai and Rigby are hair metal fans. They form a band. The plot of one episode is a ghost of a rock star. The pair of them treat guitar music with the seriousness either cartoons reserve for magic swords. And I think that's actually the show's cleverest bit of world building, because it's never explained. Nobody says these lads are into retro stuff. They just watch films on VHS, once on Laserdisc, play a console from 1986, and listen to bands who broke up before they were born. It's left completely ambiguous whether they're deeply nostalgic, or whether all of this is simply still current in their world. I've gone back and forth on which reading I prefer. I think I like the ambiguity best. Now, a couple more specific music moments worth flagging. In karaoke video, Mordecai and Rigby sing Twisted Sisters' We're Not Gonna Take It, and Pops sings Footloose. The Pops one is the funnier choice, obviously, but the Twisted Sister pick is the smarter one, because that song is fundamentally about telling your boss to get stuffed, and the episode is about two blokes who are terrified of their boss finding a video. The sequence in Grilled Cheese Deluxe, set to Lies by the Thompson Twins, has one shot in it that closely mirrors the actual music video for that song, which is a level of research nobody was going to check. And there's an odd little musical joke in Fuzzy Dice, an arcade game called Dance Like a Loser 3. The 3 is doing all the work in that gag. Somebody made 2 of those. One more, and it's from the far end of the run. In Chili Cook-Off, the episode ends with Gene saying to Benson, "You're all right, Dunwoody," using Benson's surname, which almost never comes up. Benson Dunwoody. It's in there. The thing I keep landing on with the music side of this show is how much of it exists purely for the pleasure of the people making it. A 28-note sting doesn't need 5 variations. A background game doesn't need a number in the title implying a franchise. Nobody was ever going to notice that the drum solo combines 2 different drummers from 2 different bands. But somebody did it anyway, and I think you can feel that even if you never consciously spot a single one of them. The console on Mordecai and Rigby's coffee table is a Sega Master System. Not like a Master System, it is one. The shape of the unit, the proportions, the controllers with a little directional pad and 2 buttons, it's all there, with the branding politely filed off. And at one point the show explicitly shows the box art of one of the games, which has that white grid background that many Master System releases had. That's the confirmation. There's no ambiguity left after that. I love this choice because it's slightly wrong on purpose. If you wanted shorthand for "these lads play retro games," you'd draw an S. Everyone recognises an S. The Master System is the one your mate had, the one that lost, and picking it says something about the show's whole relationship with nostalgia. It's not the greatest hits, it's the specific stuff. That extends to the games themselves. Broken Bones, which they play in high score, is based on Excite Bike. The ramps, the jumps, the physics, all of it. But the show does something better than a straight copy. In Excite Bike you wipe out, and your cyclist just hops back on the bike, perfectly fine. In Broken Bones he actually stays broken. He hobbles off on crutches or gets wheeled away in a chair, and still does a little victory dance about it. That's the joke. Someone on staff was annoyed enough by Excite Bike's cheerful disregard for injury that they wrote a whole fictional game to fix it. Dig Champs is Dig Dug, which barely needs explaining. In Death Punchies there's an 8-bit game with 2 players, one with a shovel and one with a pickaxe, cheerfully unbothered by which era it's meant to be from. The karate duo from Rage Against the TV are Billy and Jimmy Lee from Double Dragon, and it's not a loose resemblance. They're even wearing the right colours, blue and red, in the right order. The big pink monster in that game is the mandatory fat thug that every single beat 'em up is legally required to include. There's a deeper cut in there as well. The unbeatable final boss of that fictional game is called the Hammer, and he's a dead ringer for Andor from Capcom's Final Fight, which is a reference inside a reference, Double Dragon parody containing a Final Fight character. The one difference is that the Hammer has an odd weakness to being hit with furniture, which Andor did not. Its time has them playing another Double Dragon alike, and this one goes further and copies the twist ending too. Then there's Video Game Wizards, which is the show at its most pointed. The entire episode is about the Power Glove, and by extension, the film The Wizard, which was a 90-minute Nintendo advert pretending to be a movie. The show is not gentle about it. The whole gag is that the glove was oversold, unusable, and required you to input a specific individual code for every single game before it would work at all. The two rival kids, Mordecai and Skips, compete against are named Fred and Jimmy. Fred Savage starred in The Wizard. Jimmy was the name of the character at the centre of it. Someone did their homework, and the referee in that episode, fans spotted this one, nobody's confirmed it, has Philip J. Fry's exact haircut from Futurama. I can see it. It might just be a haircut. Over the Top has a genuinely lovely bit where they use the Konami code to dodge bottles being thrown at them by an angry crowd. Up, up, down, down, and so on. It's used as a real-world maneuver rather than a game input, which is a nicer version of the joke than just having somebody type it into a console. D's Keys drops the pair into what is functionally a level of marble madness after they trip an alarm and get chased by a giant globe. Bet to be Blonde opens on a game that's plainly elevator action. The space race is a sustained F-Zero homage, the anti-gravity racing, the track design, the lot. Here's a small one that I think is the neatest in the whole category. In Just Set Up the Chairs, Rigby defeats the Destroyer of Worlds, a giant floating arcade head, and when it dies it turns into a pair of cherries worth 100 points. Cherries are the first fruit in Pac-Man. Worth 100 points, that's the exact value. So the show killed a monster and paid out inaccurate Pac-Man scoring. Nobody says anything about it. It just happens and the episode moves on. There's also High Score itself, which is worth mentioning with a caveat. The pair are trying to set a record on an arcade cabinet and get thwarted by a giant floating bearded face. A lot of people have read that as a Billy Mitchell joke, the famously bearded, famously contested Donkey Kong record holder. Nobody official has ever said so. Given how much else in this show is deliberate, I'd say it's likely, but I'm not going to state it as fact. And one more that's audio rather than visual. At the end of one episode, when Rigby says he wants to be player 2 again, the music that plays is from Berserk on the Atari 2600. That's not a visual gag or a design nod, that's someone digging out a specific 1980 arcade port's audio to use as a punchline for one line of dialogue. That's the thing about the game references in this show. They're not there to make you feel included. Half of them you're clearly not meant to get. They're in there because the people making it thought they were funny, and that's a much better reason. The other thing about the game references is how they're framed within the show itself. Mordecai and Rigby don't play games the way characters in cartoons usually play games, as a quick establishing beat before the plot arrives. They play them properly. Episodes open on them mid-session. There are arguments about who's player 2. There's an entire episode built around a high score. And crucially, the games are treated as having stakes that are obviously ridiculous and yet completely serious to them. That's a very specific kind of joke that only works if the people writing it genuinely remember caring that much about an arcade cabinet. There's a run of smaller game nods scattered through the series that don't get much attention. In Saving Time, somebody asks whether they're bad enough dudes to teach Benson a lesson, which is the opening text of Bad Dudes, the arcade game about rescuing the president from ninjas. That line has become a bit of an internet fixture in its own right, so hearing it turn up in a cartoon in the middle of an episode is a nice surprise. The moves Mordecai uses to fight the picture, slides in bad portrait, are lifted straight out of Street Fighter, poses and all. And Benson's suit has Street Fighter in the mix as well, alongside the tuxedo and, of all things, Kill la Kill, which is a set of references that shouldn't fit together, and somehow does. The game they're playing in The Previous Owner, one of the Terror Tales segments, closely resembles the notoriously difficult Friday the 13th game on the NES, which is a good choice for a horror segment because that game is genuinely miserable to play, and everyone who owned it remembers it. Then there's Stick Hockey, which is technically a film reference sitting inside a games episode. Mordecai and Rigby face a character called Chong, who looks virtually identical to Tong Po from the 1989 Jean-Claude Van Damme film Kickboxer, and the whole sequence is staged like that film's climactic fight. His name is also a nod to Chong Li from Bloodsport, which is a different Van Damme film. So it's two Van Damme references welded onto one bloke playing table hockey. And there's a small detail at the start of that episode that people have picked over. Benson steps in chewing gum before any of it kicks off. Some fans have tried to make something of it, given that Benson is a gumball machine and therefore full of the stuff. I'd file that under coincidence. People step in gum. It's a normal thing that happens, but I can see why it gets brought up. Marvolo the Wizard gives Muscle Man and High Five Ghost alter egos named Palom and Porom, which are the twin mages from Final Fantasy IV. That's a properly obscure pull. Palom and Porom are not characters anyone name drops casually. That's My Television features a character called RGB2, which is R2D2, with the letters shuffled and a display technology joke bolted on. And Tecmo, who we've already touched on, is a reference stacked several deep. The name itself is one letter off Tecmo, the games company. His whole build, an orc technomancer who fixes machines with magic, is functionally a Shadowrun character without ever using the word. And his car, as mentioned, is a DeLorean. That's one supporting character carrying a games company, a tabletop RPG, and a film franchise simultaneously. Skips destroying a computer with a sledgehammer in that same episode is a nod to Apple's 1984 advert, which is the sort of thing you only clock if you've seen the advert 100 times, which most people over a certain age have. I do think there's something quite generous about all of this. None of these references are load-bearing. You can watch every one of these episodes, catch 0 of them, and have a perfectly good time. They're not gatekeeping anything. They're just there, quietly, for anyone who happens to know. There's a shot in Excellent where Mordecai has to choose an I'm Excellent hat from a chamber absolutely full of different hats, watched over by a knight. That's the Grail Room from Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. Same setup, same lighting, same ancient guardian who's been standing there for centuries, waiting for someone to pick correctly. What makes it a proper nerd's reference rather than a lazy one is which bit of Indiana Jones they picked. Everybody parodies the boulder. The boulder is the default. Almost nobody goes for the quiet, tense, final scene of the third film. And the fact that Regular Show did says a lot about who was in that writer's room, and they didn't leave it there. The Excellent Knight comes back in Ace Balthazar Lives, wanders into a mosh pit, and gets immediately flattened. His response is, I moshed poorly. A centuries-old Grail Guardian, defeated by a gig. That's the best possible use of a returning character. That same episode ends by teasing a new eating challenge involving a 96-ounce steak, which is a nod to the old 96er from The Great Outdoors, which again is not the film you'd expect anyone to be referencing in 2011. Now, it's Skips versus Technology is where the 80s film shelf really opens up. The episode's about two immortals, Skips and his old mate Tecmo, and Tecmo drives a car that is very clearly a DeLorean DMC-12, which normally is just shorthand for Back to the Future, but here it actually means something, because the episode is genuinely about people who have been alive across centuries. The time machine car belongs to the time-displaced characters. That's not decoration, that's design. Back to the Future shows up again in the local shopping centre in Muscle Woman, which is called Two Peaks Mall. In the film, it's the Twin Pines Mall, until Marty runs over a tree and it becomes the Lone Pine Mall. So Two Peaks is doing double duty. It's a Back to the Future gag and a Twin Peaks gag at the same time. Do Me a Solid has one that I think is the single most obscure reference in the series. Mordecai and Rigby go to a cinema, and the first thing on screen is a bellhop, who who is unmistakably an animated Paul Rubens, saying that someone has a telephone call at the front desk. That's the paging Mr. Herman scene from Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and the lobby design matches too. The title of that episode, incidentally, comes from Seinfeld. The whole "do me a solid" construction. Big Trouble in Little China turns up twice, which suggests somebody on staff really loved it. First in This Is My Jam, where the fight between the park crew and the possessed cassette tape is staged like the Egg Shen versus Lopan showdown. And then again in Fortune Cookie, with the sorcerer drawn as Lopan and voiced by the actor who played him. Grave Sites is basically a horror film reading list. Mordecai tries to rent an Italian film called Libraria. The film they actually watch, Zombocalypse, is Army of Darkness with a Bruce Campbell lookalike who won't stop dispensing one-liners and carries a boomstick he never actually fires. Its cover art is doom. The shot of the zombies clawing up out of their graves is the return of the living dead. The premise, a film that creates zombies, is demons, and the extremely large zombie at the end is the tank from Left 4 Dead. That's 5 or 6 references in one 11-minute episode in the background while a plot is happening. Elsewhere, the delinquent unicorn in The Unicorns Have Got to Go is dressed as Alex from A Clockwork Orange. Bowler Hat, the lot, in a children's cartoon about unicorns. Out of Commission is the one that gets people though. It's the episode where the golf cart dies and its final words are lifted from Roy Batty's speech at the end of Blade Runner. The Tears in Rain monologue, delivered by a cart. And the episode plays it completely straight. It's actually quite sad, which is a mad thing to be able to say about a golf cart. Trailer Trashed restages the ending of Mad Max 2 more or less exactly, including the reveal that the convoy was a decoy the whole time, and the thing everyone was fighting over was somewhere else entirely. That's not a nod, that's a full structural lift. There's a run of these whole episode homages, actually. Gamers Never Say Die is the Goonies from top to bottom. The Lunch Club is 15 minutes of The Breakfast Club. Weekend at Benson's is exactly what the title promises, and I've got no notes on that one. The end of Win That Prize pays off like the final scene of The Usual Suspects, which is a hell of a thing to put at the end of a game show episode. And Benson's Suit, where a sentient suit has been causing chaos all episode, ends with Benson lowering it into a washing machine on a high setting so it can't hurt anyone else. On the way down, the sleeve gives a thumbs up. That's Terminator 2. The molten steel, the thumbs up, the sacrifice, except it's a suit, and it's a washing machine, and somehow it still lands. That's the trick this show pulled off repeatedly. It would set up a joke premise, execute it with the exact framing of a genuinely moving scene from a proper film, and then not undercut it. The reference does the emotional work. You feel the T2 ending even though what you're watching is laundry. There's a whole other tier of these that are less about restaging a scene and more about lifting a mood. Sugar Rush is a good example. The episode is about 4 blokes racing to buy replacement donuts and get back before a meeting. Completely mundane stakes. But as they get closer to the park, the music and the imagery start borrowing from Inception. Those enormous slow brass blasts, the sense of layers collapsing into each other. It's an absurd amount of gravity to apply to a donut run, and that mismatch is the entire joke. The Christmas special does something similar with The Lord of the Rings. There's a box that corrupts whoever holds it and has to be destroyed in molten lava, which is very similar to the One Ring with a different shape. And there's a scene where Muscle Man tries to smash it with a hammer that mirrors Gimli going at the ring with his axe, right down to the outcome. That same special also has Santa, Mordecai and Rigby using a hoverboard, a bulletproof vest, a flying vehicle with flame trails, and an invisibility cloak, which is a fairly transparent set of Back to the Future Part 2 bits packaged as Christmas gadgets. Garage Door has a scene with giant laser-firing statues that is very reminiscent of the never-ending story. The Sphinxes. If you saw that film as a child, it lives somewhere unpleasant in your memory forever, and seeing it turn up in a cartoon about a garage door is genuinely startling. Hello Governor is less a reference to one film than to an entire subgenre, those endless low-budget slashers where the killer is an inanimate object that's somehow possessed. It's a killer taxi. There is no specific film it's copying the whole shelf. Then there's the one that's just a good title. Over the Top is named after, and features arm wrestling like the Sylvester Stallone arm wrestling film, which is a film that exists that people made on purpose about arm wrestling. One Pull-Up is Rocky, straightforwardly, the training montage, the whole shape of it. And the equipment Rigby uses to get strong quickly is called the Russian, which points at Ivan Drago's lab-assisted training in Rocky High 4. So even within a Rocky homage, they're being specific about which Rocky. Every Meat Burritos has a character called Barry, whose slow-motion overreaction to being punched is apparently lifted from a 1973 Turkish film called Karateci Kiz, which has a death scene with a reputation as one of the worst ever committed to film. I want to be clear about how obscure that is. That is not a reference. That is somebody on staff having a very particular hobby. Prankless has Muscle Man reciting Willy Wonka's tunnel speech during the ultimate prank, which is a properly unsettling choice, and Willy Wonka comes back again in Pam I Am with the fizzy lifting drinks scene. Benson and Pam get sucked toward a fan and escape by burping. The trailer for Zombie Dinner Party has arms bursting through a wall in the manner of Day of the Dead, and The Dream Warrior takes its name from the subtitle of the third Nightmare on Elm Street film. In that same episode, the characters watch a parody of Scooby-Doo, which is a much gentler reference sitting right next to a slasher one. Future Mordecai at one point says, "The future's so bright we gotta wear shades," which is Timbuk 3, and which is one of those lines that's been absorbed into general use to the point where a lot of people won't register it as a quote at all. What I find genuinely impressive about the sheer volume of this stuff is that the show never gets clogged with it. An episode packed with 6 references still functions as an episode. The plot still resolves. Nobody stops to explain anything. That's much harder than it sounds. Plenty of shows have tried the reference-dense approach and ended up with something that's only a delivery mechanism for the jokes. Regular Show manages to be a proper show that happens to be full of them, which is a completely different achievement. Picture the outfit first before I tell you anything else about it. Heavy shoulder pads, angular armour, a very particular golden navy colour scheme, worn by a raccoon who has recently and legally changed his name to Trash Boat. You don't land on that pallet by accident. That's Judge Dredd, and it fits the episode better than it has any right to because the antagonist is a future version of a British rock star who's turned up to eliminate Rigby without giving him any chance to explain himself, which is more or less Dredd's entire approach to policing. I like that one a lot, mainly because it's the sort of costume a kid would just accept as generic armour and an adult would sit up at. Meteor Moves gives us the Friend Zone, which is drawn as the Phantom Zone from Superman 2, the flat pane spinning off into nothing. It's a very silly joke about dating rendered with genuinely accurate DC iconography. In Think Positive, Benson finally loses it and starts glowing with a rage aura and floating. People read this a couple of ways. Some say Super Saiyan, some say Dark Phoenix from the X-Men. Both fit. Nobody's confirmed which one was in the room, and honestly, at the level of angry character surrounded by fire and flying, the two are close enough that it might have been either. Now, Brilliant Century Duck Crisis Special is where the show fully stops pretending. It is a love letter to mecha anime. Start to finish, the title and the opening are Neon Genesis Evangelion. Benson suits up in the style of Mobile Fighter G Gundam. There are references throughout to Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann and Turner Gundam and a stack of others. The long-lost duck brother, Andy, is styled after Quattro Bagina. And it ends with a shot of a Tyrannosaurus and a Stegosaurus fighting with weapons strapped to them, because why not? A bunch of full-grown geese does the same thing for tokusatsu. The mega geese resemble Doublus M2 from Mazinger Z. The mega ducks shout the name of their attack and fire a rocket punch, also Mazinger. One attack is the specium beam from Ultraman. The helmet design leans Voltron, and the transformation sequence, an organic being receiving a suit of powered armour piloted by his allies, is closer to Gridman than to anything more famous. That is an extraordinarily deep well to be drawing from for a fight between birds. Here's the thing I keep wondering about with those two episodes though. Somebody had to pitch them. Somebody sat in a room at Cartoon Network Studios and said, right, this week the ducks become a giant robot, and we're doing it in the visual language of Evangelion. And somebody else said yes, that's the part I'd like to have seen. Anyway. The live-action telly references are a bit more scattered but no less specific. The two agents in Stake Me Amadeus are Mulder and Scully, drawn as such. The world's greatest boss is an exact lookalike of Lumbergh from Office Space, which is a beautiful choice given the show's whole relationship with employment. In Skip's verse technology, the virus tells Tecmo, prepare to be assimilated, resistance is dumb, which is the Borg with one word swapped and is somehow funnier for it. Tecmo's Halloween costume, by the way, is Spike Spiegel from Cowboy Bebop, and Tecmo's voiced by Steve Blum, who voiced Spike. So that's the second time this show has cast the original actor and then dressed the character up as the original role, which stops being a coincidence and starts being a habit. Picking up Margaret gives us the Wickets, a gang who are patterned on the rival gangs from the Warriors, particularly the Baseball Furies, and one of them asks Mordecai to stop using his phone in the exact cadence of Warriors come out to play aye, which is a wonderfully petty thing to reference. Then there's the Terror Tales of the Park Run, which is structurally a treehouse of horror. Same shape. Halloween special. 3 separate horror segments, 30 minutes, Roman numerals in the title, 1 per year. The Simpsons' influence on Quintel was well documented, and this is the clearest expression of it. The costumes across those specials are worth listing on their own, because whoever picks them was having a great time. Rigby as M. Bison, Muscle Man as Snake Plissken, Pops as the Fourth Doctor, Mordecai as Bruce Lee from Enter the Dragon, Benson as Sherlock Holmes, Skips as Rambo, Eileen as Kiki the Witch in one year, and Samus Aran in another. In a later one, Rigby goes as Tetsuo from Akira, High-Five Ghost's high-fiving hand becomes E.T.'s glowing finger, and Skips' 3 pecs are a Total Recall gag. In a story within the story, Eileen is Captain Janeway, Mordecai is Han Solo, Muscle Man is Dr. Zaius, and Skips is John Nada from They Live. None of those are explained. Nobody says, hey, nice Dr. Zaius. They're just wearing them. Skip Strikes leans on the Big Lebowski and quotes it twice. That's just like, your opinion, man. And both sides accusing each other of being out of their element, which for a bowling episode is exactly the right film to be robbing. And then there's Death himself, who is one of the great character designs in the show. He rides a motorcycle, which is a Discworld nod. He says, your soul is mine, which is Shang Tsung from Mortal Kombat. And he looks unmistakably like Lemmy from Motorhead. The accent, the sideburns, and the 2 moles on the left cheek. 2 moles on the correct side. That's the level of specificity we're dealing with. There's a category of these I'd separate out, which is the references that aren't to films or shows at all, but to other bits of internet and comics culture that were floating around at the time. In But I Have a Receipt, Benson's character in the tabletop game, Darthan, is dressed as Link. Straight up, green tunic, the lot. And the game itself, The Realm of Darthan, is essentially World of Cinnabar, an infamously overcomplicated RPG with a reputation among people who care about that sort of thing. There's a character in the rulebook briefly called She-Cop, which is a genuinely obscure DC Comics deep cut, and one that got a lot stranger years later when the character resurfaced in Tom King's Danger Street. In Access Denied, LaDonna uses an Omega Beam. That's Darkseid's. That's a specific DC power with a specific name, handed to a minor antagonist in a cartoon about the internet. The Death Star at one point has Kanye shades, and the transport system it uses resembles the one from They Live, which is a film Skips also dresses as a character from in a later Halloween special. Somebody really liked They Live. Exit 9B is worth flagging structurally, rather than as a single gag. The plot is that the son of a previous villain opens a portal to another dimension to resurrect his father and every previous villain the show has ever had, and he's ultimately stopped when the newest and youngest character helps suck them all back through. That's a very deliberate shape. It's the sort of thing a long-running series does when it wants to acknowledge its own history without doing a clip show. There are a few that are pure name jokes. One of the ghost truckers at the Trucker Hall of Fame is called Huge Marge, which is Large Marge from Pee-wee's Big Adventure again. That film really does come up more than any other. Party Pete's two escorts are named Janet and Chrissy, which is Three's company. One of the people Rigby invites to a party and replaced is named Geodude, which is Geoduda from Pokemon with a space in it. Reggie in New Bro on Campus is drawn like John Connor's mate Tim from Terminator 2 and is voiced by Danny Cooksey, who played that exact character. So that's the third time this show has cast the original actor and then dressed the character as the original role. At this point, it's clearly policy. Snowballs the ice monster bears a strong resemblance to a Kazoo from Monster Hunter, right down to being found somewhere freezing. Mordaby and Rigbakai takes its title from a fan-made YouTube series called Ultimate Cartoon Fighting, in which Mordecai and Rigby fuse into one being and then immediately start arguing about what to call the result. That's the show referencing its own fandom, which is a slightly odd thing to do and quite sweet. The ships in Party Horse look like Scion pods. When Pops and Anti-Pops go giant in the final battle, Pops gets spiky Super Saiyan hair, and Anti-Pops gets horns and armoured shoulder pads over a bare chest, which is Rao from Fist of the North Star. And in Really Real Wrestling, 4Armageddon slaps Mordecai and kicks Rigby while asking whether it's fake, because they'd claimed wrestling was. That's a restaging of a genuinely notorious moment where wrestler David Schultz slapped a journalist twice on camera for saying the same thing, asking each time whether that had felt fake. That's not a pop culture reference so much as a piece of wrestling history, dropped into a children's cartoon, unlabelled. The store called Das Coolest in one episode is Urban Outfitters with the name changed, which is the most 90s noughties joke in the entire series. And in New Beds, they visit a furniture shop that's plainly IKEA, where one of the workers happens to be a large yellow bird. I'll leave that one there. Skips has 5 fingers. He's the only character in the entire show who does. Everyone else has 4, because 4 is easier to animate, and has been the cartoon standard since roughly forever. Nobody has ever explained it. There are theories. One is that it's a Simpsons thing. On The Simpsons, only God and Jesus get 5 fingers, and Quintel grew up on that show, so it might be a marker that Skips exists on a different tier. Another is that it's just a quiet visual signal of his immortality. Another is that it's a Mark Hamill joke that got away from someone. I don't think we're ever getting an answer, and I'm quite content with that. High Five Ghost has a shadow, which, if you think about it for even a second, is not how ghosts work, and in a lot of shots he's the only character who has one, which makes it stranger rather than less strange. Again, no explanation on record. Eileen's first appearance looks wrong, if you go back to it. Her eyes were plain black dots behind thin black frames, and the effect is genuinely a bit unsettling. She looks blank in a way that doesn't match her personality at all. By her second appearance, they'd redrawn her with the big expressive eyes and red glasses everyone knows. It's one of the fastest and most decisive redesigns in the show, and they were right to do it. Now, Don has one that requires actual art knowledge to catch. The pictures hung around Don's living room, especially the ones surrounding the portrait of him and Rigby, are a straight homage to the work of Patrick Nagel, the 80s illustrator with the very flat, very stylised women in bold blocks of colour. That's the aesthetic of a Duran Duran album cover, sitting on the wall of a raccoon's house, and it's doing character work. It tells you exactly what sort of person Don is without a line of dialogue. Muscle Man's trailer has Pink Floyd posters in it, Dark Side of the Moon in one episode, and Wish You Were Here in another, which honestly is perfect. Of course he does. There's a Problem Solvers cameo in an early episode with two of their main characters just sitting in the background. That's Cartoon Network shows nodding at each other, which they did fairly often around that period. In Bet to Be Blonde, one of the items of clothing chucked around the living room looks a lot like Gumball's jumper from The Amazing World of Gumball. Small, deniable, probably deliberate. The costume party in See You There is worth pausing on. There's a woman dressed as Kelty from Durarara, which is an anime reference nobody was expecting, and somebody else has come as Ice King from Adventure Time. The two shows aired back to back for years, so that one's almost neighbourly. Go Viral is a proper time capsule. The Internet Warden's prison has Antoine Dodson of Bed Intruder fame on a screen. When everyone escapes, you can spot the peanut butter jelly time banana in the crowd. And at the end, when Mordecai and Rigby are gloating, the Tourette's guy is standing among them. Those are three of the most specific mid-2000s internet artifacts imaginable, all in one episode, and I'd guess a meaningful chunk of the audience watching today has no idea any of them existed. Eileen's calculator in Video 101 reads 2112, which is a Rush album, and given the Neil Peart-flavoured drum solo elsewhere in the show, somebody on staff was clearly a Rush person. Mordecai and Rigby went to West Anderson High School, revealed in Rigby in the Sky with Burrito. Wes Anderson, Rushmore again. That film's fingerprints really are all over this thing. In Lift With Your Back, two of Rigby's co-workers are called Joe and Murray. Joe Murray created Rocco's Modern Life and Camp Laszlo, and Quintel worked on Camp Laszlo as a storyboard revisionist early in his career. So that's a thank you note hidden in a background character list. There's a third worker in that same episode named Rorschach, which is a completely different reference sitting right next to it. Here's one that's less of a hidden joke and more of a slightly bleak piece of world building. In Brilliant Century Duck Crisis Special, Mordecai gets offered $100 for the use of his likeness, and he compares that to about a month's wages, which means these two are being paid an amount that is nowhere near legal anywhere. It's played as a joke, but it does quietly explain the entire premise of the show, why they're always broke, why they live in the house they work at, why every single plot starts with them being unable to afford something. Some fans reckon they're paying off damages to the park, which would also explain a lot. Either way, Benson is not a good employer, and I've said what I've said, and to finish this lot off, one that isn't hidden so much as accidental. The Season 5 episode Power Tower aired for the first time in an unfinished state. Wrong colours, missing polish, visibly not done. Cartoon Network had simply put the wrong file out. The correct version aired a few days later, which means for one broadcast only, there was a version of regular show on air that nobody involved had signed off on. If you happened to be watching that afternoon, you saw something almost nobody else did. Something I have noticed going back through the show is how much of the background is doing quiet consistency work rather than joke work. The park has a fixed geography. The house is always the same house. The cart is always the same cart until it isn't, and that becomes an episode. Compared to a lot of cartoons which reset their world every 11 minutes, regular show is fairly disciplined about where things are, which makes the odd bits stand out more. Take the skate park in Cool Bikes, which has been described by fans as being built in memory of poser Pete from Skate or Die. That's the show building a small piece of civic history for itself out of an earlier episode's minor character. It's the sort of thing that makes a fictional place feel like it's been there a while. Or Mordecai's second cool outfit in that same episode, which is a jacket and striped red and white shirt combination that looks a great deal like Ed from Cowboy Bebop, which, given Tecmo's Spike costume elsewhere, suggests one particular anime was on heavy rotation in that building. There's a department store in Bet to be Blonde called Mervington's, which is a nod to Mervyn's, a real California department store chain that had already closed down by the time the episode aired. That's a very local joke. If you didn't grow up in that part of the world, it means absolutely nothing. Which is true of a fair bit of this show, actually. Quintel is from Hanford, worked in Burbank, and a lot of the incidental texture is Californian in a way that's completely invisible unless you're from there. Here's a small one that I think is genuinely lovely. In Grilled Cheese Deluxe, one of the spaceships visible in the compound is Thunderbird 1. Not a similar craft, that specific vehicle from Thunderbirds, sitting in the background of an episode about a sandwich, and in Rigby's body, one of the snacks made is a Twinkie Wiener sandwich, which is from Weird Al's film UHF. Weird Al invented that sandwich for a joke in 1989, and it has been quietly haunting American pop culture ever since. There's a shake weight advert in Do Me a Solid, which dates the episode to within about 18 months. Dead at 8 has a demon children's pop-up book called The Hungry, Soul-Sucking Deathworm, which is a board game reference wrapped around a monster name, and it's read aloud, like it's completely normal. One of the characters in Planet Chaser's Starlight Excellence resembles Astro Boy. Peeps from the episode of the same name ends up as a giant floating eyeball with 10 smaller eye stalks, which is a beholder from Dungeons & Dragons. And his full name, Jeepers Peepers X Infinity, plays off the horror film Jeepers Creepers. Now there's one more visual quirk that runs through the whole show, and it's about the character designs generally. Almost everyone in this world is a human-shaped person with a fairly ordinary design, but the park employees, the coffee shop employees, and the families of both are all wildly distinctive. A bird, a raccoon, a gumball machine, a yeti, a lollipop, a ghost. That's a very specific dividing line, and the show never once addresses it. You can read that as pure convenience. The main cast needed to be visually distinct, the extras didn't. But it does create this odd unspoken suggestion that everyone we're following is somehow set apart from the general population. And given how much the series is about a small group of people who don't quite fit into normal adult life, that reading holds up better than it probably should. I don't think it was planned. I think it's an accident of design that ended up meaning something, which is often how these things go. Right, there was for a brief window a condom wrapper visible in a Cartoon Network cartoon. It's not actually in Prank Callers. The master prank caller is taking a bath, and there's a shot of the bathroom floor, and on that floor is a wrapper. It aired. Then somebody noticed, and in every rerun since it's been cropped out or digitally removed, but it was there on television in the afternoon. That's the perfect illustration of what the early seasons were like. Not because anyone was trying to sneak filth past children, but because the show was operating right at the edge of a TV PG rating that the network was actively experimenting with at the time. And occasionally, something got through. In Fortune Cookie, there's a dim sum cart that passes through a shot with a slur written on it. Not a subtle one either. That was scrubbed out as well. And rightly so, that one reads as a genuine mistake rather than a joke. And it's good that it's gone. The most famous edit is from the very first episode. The Power originally had Rigby say, "How in the H are we going to fix this S?" Which is a lovely bit of writing actually, its characters censoring themselves, which is funnier than either swearing or not swearing. In later airings it became, "How in the heck are we going to fix this stuff?" which kills it completely. The joke was that they were bleeping themselves. Once you fill in the blanks with actual words, there's nothing there. The UK got there first, incidentally, with their own version, How in the H Are We Going to Fix This Hole? Well before the American edit happened. Then there's the Pissed situation. Pissed Off appears in a few early episodes and got redubbed to Ticked Off across the board. Except in Free Cake, where Benson's Gonna Be Pissed was changed to Gonna Get Ticked, presumably because whoever was doing the pass specifically caught it. So there's one instance of it still sitting in the show, right next to episodes where the identical word was scrubbed. After those first few episodes, the crew were told they couldn't use pseudo-swears anymore at all. Screwed Up and Sucks hung on, but the general license was withdrawn. If you've ever felt like the show got tamer as it went, that's not nostalgia playing tricks. The rules genuinely tightened around them. The Halloween specials caught it worse than anything. The last 3 minutes of the first Terror Tales of the Park had to be completely redone because the network judged it too gory. The replacement ending has Rigby getting egged by a giant egg, which sounds harmless until you remember that a later episode establishes Rigby has a severe egg allergy and nearly dies from one. So the safe version is arguably a slower and more upsetting death than whatever they cut. The second Halloween special also had its ending rejected for being too much. The one that aired instead has a tow truck crash into a tree and everyone emerge as ghosts, which I'm not sure that's the improvement they thought it was. Trucker Hall of Fame lost a flashback of Muscle Dad telling Muscle Man to take a raincoat to prom because the censors read, "Muscle Dad, I don't need no protection from the rain," as a condom joke, which, to be fair to the censors, it very obviously is. And in The Unicorns Have Got to Go, the person the unicorns bring for Mordecai was originally scripted as an obviously cross-dressed man in a fairly revealing outfit. That got flagged and the replacement is a blonde biker who looks a bit like Robert Plant. I think the biker's funnier, so this one worked out. Overseas it got stranger. In the UK, turds was famously changed to planks, which is a British insult meaning something like idiot, thick as a plank. So the line still functions, it just sounds bizarre to anyone outside the UK. That same broadcast cut a shot of Santa being shot, while leaving a substantial amount of gun violence in Fuzzy Dice completely intact, which is a set of priorities I cannot map. Australia redrew the dump cam screen. In the original, it's a toilet. In the Australian broadcast, it's a dumpster. Somebody actually animated a new screen. The Unicorns Have Got to Go was banned outright in Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Nobody's ever said exactly why, though given the episode's general commitment to gross-out humour, you can make a decent guess. The real Thomas was pulled in Russia because the premise is that Thomas turns out to be a Russian spy. In other territories, the episode was allowed to run, but the country was renamed Druzhnia, and the Russian references were taken out. And my favourite dub change of the lot. In the Latin American Spanish version of Diary, Mordecai's confession that he likes going commando was replaced with a confession that he loves Adventure Time, which is a completely different admission with completely different implications. And I would love to have been in the room where that was decided. It's worth stepping back and thinking about why this show, specifically, ran into so much of this. Cartoon Network was in an unusual mood around 2010. They were actively trying to age the network up a bit, and TV-PG was a rating they were willing to push at. Regular Show and Adventure Time both came out of that window, as part of Cartoon Network's early 2010s push for more TV-PG shows that could also appeal to older viewers. But a rating is only ever a compromise, and the moment complaints start arriving, the compromise gets renegotiated, usually not in the show's favour. You can actually chart it across the run. The first 3 seasons are the loosest. After the season 5 finale, a lot of the violence and the suggestive material had to be toned down further, which is why the later episodes feel notably softer to a lot of people. That's not the crew running out of ideas. That's a set of instructions arriving from above. And it's slightly odd in hindsight because the material that supposedly triggered the tightening, the love triangle, the Make a Duck episode is some of the show's most ambitious work. The territorial differences are where it gets properly strange though. The UK edits are the most thoroughly documented, largely because a fan sat down and catalogued them all, and the pattern that emerges is inconsistent in a way that's quite funny. Kissing gets cut. Slow motion running towards a kiss gets cut. Frames showing tongues get removed. When a character's back tattoos are shown, the screen simply freezes rather than panning further down. A man farting through a harmonica was reanimated, so he was putting kazoos up his nose instead, and the music underneath was rescored to match the new footage. Somebody had to animate that. Somebody had to write new music for it. For a fart joke. Flashing effects got slowed down, which is a genuine safety consideration rather than a taste one. And "Do you think I'm a moron?" became "Do you think I'm a dummy?" which changes nothing and helps nobody. The Asia Pacific broadcasts had their own version of this, where words like crap, piss and turd were swapped for crud, tick and plank. Which is why the plank thing shows up in more than one region. Anything showing a clerk with a ruler or a sword in his chest was cut. A scene of a character crying in the shower was zoomed in on his face, so you couldn't see anything else. Several Halloween-adjacent episodes were originally refused entirely and then allowed to air later, but only on Halloween nights specifically, which is a compromise I quite admire actually. You can have your horror once a year at the appropriate time. There's a nice bit of inconsistency worth mentioning too. Some of these edits vanished entirely once the show hit streaming, so episodes that were cut on broadcast turned up intact later, and at least one episode was available uncensored on Netflix, while other episodes from the same season were only there in their edited form. Meaning the version of regular show you saw depends enormously on where you were, when you watched it, and on what. There's no single canonical cut of this show. There's a scattered set of them, all slightly different, and some of the original versions only exist on DVDs that were released in a couple of regions and then quietly stopped, which is a bit of a shame, but it's also very in keeping with a show that spent its entire run being just slightly too odd for the slot it was in. There's a whole shadow version of this show sitting in storyboards and abandoned pitches, and some of it is genuinely better than what aired. Take Skips. His secret, the reason he's immortal, the thing everyone spends seasons wondering about, was originally going to be that he made a deal with the Guardians of Eternal Youth. That's it. A tragic love story, a bargain with the Guardians of Eternal Youth. Just mates with the elements. I'm glad they went the other way, because Skips' story ended up being one of the most emotionally direct episodes in the run. But there's a version of the show where Skips is a bloke who knows some elemental beings socially, and it's much lighter. In that same episode, there was a beat where the Guardians of Eternal Youth were going to laugh at Walk's choice of new name, which would have been funny, but would also have punctured the moment completely. So it went. Skunked is the big one. The episode as it exists is about Rigby getting sprayed and then transforming. The original version was about Rigby getting sprayed and then being an absolute nightmare to everyone, because he'd convinced himself they all hated him for smelling. That's a much more character-driven episode, and much more genuinely uncomfortable. It got greenlit, it was in production, and then it was scrapped last minute and rewritten. The original storyboard exists and it's floating around online if you go looking. Casting-wise, according to writer Calvin Wong, the crew wanted Hulk Hogan for Muscle Dad. Which, yes, obviously. Of course they did. Muscle Dad is a Hulk Hogan character, in every respect except the voice, and I'd have paid money for that version. Margaret was originally going to be unclothed, the same as Mordecai, which is consistent, because Mordecai's a bird, and birds don't wear jumpers. They changed it for what the record politely describes as obvious reasons. Mordecai and the Rigbys had a cutscene I genuinely love to have seen. Mordecai and Rigby were going to ask Benson why there were instruments in the garage, which would trigger a flashback to Benson's hippie years, where his girlfriend, another gumball machine, named Veronica, leaves him for a businessman. Benson with long hair and a guitar, getting dumped by a gumball machine. That's a whole character backstory that simply never made it to air, and it would have reframed his entire relationship with music in the series. CJ is an interesting case because the change came from inside the room rather than from a network note. She was originally conceived as more of a difficult woman archetype, and writer Kat Morris pushed back on it. She felt it was misogynistic and rewrote the character. What we got instead is somebody with a couple of genuine emotional hang-ups, who's otherwise kind and well-adjusted, which is far more interesting and considerably more human. That's a good instinct, and it's worth flagging that it came from a writer arguing with the room rather than from anyone above them. Mordecai's mum went through something similar. The original conception was that she'd be critical of him specifically, a model parent to everyone else in the world, but never satisfied with her own son. That's a real thing that happens to people, and it would have been sharp. What we got is a mum who's embarrassing but well-meaning, with a dad who's fairly sane and a bit of a pushover. Benton Connor, one of the writers, apparently kept pitching episodes about Mordecai and Rigby's parents, and the room kept passing on it. We eventually got the Thanksgiving special, and maxing and relaxing, but both are relatively light. There was clearly more appetite for that material among the staff than ever made it to screen. Small one, but I like it. In Do Me a Solid, Rigby was originally going to keep the tape rather than destroy it. That's the opposite ending, morally speaking, and it changes what the episode's actually saying about their friendship. And then there's my favourite bit of production trivia in this whole category. From I Like You High, the character Yuji was intended by writers Toby Jones and Owen Dennis to be a parody of reality TV personalities who think they're famous. Solid idea. The problem was that the only reality show both of them had actually watched was Sweet Genius, a Food Network program where chefs make bizarre desserts under pressure, so they had nothing to parody. Yuji ended up not being based on anything at all. He's a parody of a genre neither writer had seen. His tattoo was also originally going to be on his forehead, and some jokes in the episode lost bits that changed what they were even about. That's a wonderfully honest bit of behind-the-scenes admission. Two writers set out to make a satire and accidentally invented a bloke. The last thing I'd put in this section isn't a cut idea, it's a bit of context that makes all of the above land differently. Each episode of regular show took roughly 9 months to make. 9 months for 11 minutes, which means every one of these abandoned versions represents a real chunk of somebody's year, and every last-minute scrap, like skunked, meant throwing away work that people had already lived with for a long time. There's a particular type of fan speculation that turns up around this show, which I want to flag, because a lot of it gets repeated as fact. The big one is the Adult Swim story, which I'll come back to properly later on. But there are smaller ones too, and the pattern is always the same. The show is unusual enough that people invent explanations for it, and those explanations get more confident every time they're repeated. For instance, plenty of people were convinced well in advance that Margaret was lying about having a boyfriend in 1000th chopper flight party. They were right, as it turned out. A not great double date confirmed it later. But being right doesn't make the guess a secret. It makes it a good guess. The reason I mention it is that when you're going through material like this, it's very easy to blur the line between the crew confirmed this and the internet decided this. I've tried to keep them separate throughout, which is why some of these come with a shrug attached. Anyway, back to the things that genuinely nearly happened. Do Me a Solid is the episode that keeps coming up in the cut material, and it's not surprising. It's an episode about favours escalating into humiliation. So there was presumably a lot of room to go further or less far. Another set of what-ifs sits around the show's relationship with continuity. Regular show is unusually willing to let things stick. Characters get jobs, break up, move house, graduate. Mordecai's artistic talent is established early and quietly pays off at the very end of the series when he becomes a professional artist. It's revealed at one point that he went to art college and didn't graduate, which is a small, slightly sad detail that also happens to mirror the sort of thing that happens to real people constantly. That episode about his art, incidentally, is based on something that actually happened to Quintel. He was at art school, gave a girl a bad drawing of herself, and made her cry. That's the seed of a whole episode. There's a similar thing with Eileen. Her surname is Roberts, and the show never announces it. She just signs a test at the start of an episode, and it's there if you're paying attention. And the origins of the Fists of Justice get explained in an episode where Eileen already knows about a band she wasn't around for, which is either a continuity slip or a suggestion that these people talk about their band history far too much. I lean towards the latter because it's funnier. There's a mild running gag in the production itself that I quite like. Mordecai and Rigby reuse the same scream at least 4 times across the series. That's not a reference, that's just somebody deciding a particular take was good enough to keep using, which is a very old animation tradition. One more thing on the near misses. When the show was heading towards its end, Quintel's position with the network was apparently very direct. He told them that if they weren't going to pick it up for another season, they should say so the crew could end it properly. Which they did, and the show got a real ending rather than a cancellation, and that's a much rarer outcome than it should be. Plenty of shows with a bigger audience than this one just stopped mid-sentence. I think about that a lot in the context of everything in this section, all the abandoned versions, the scrapped episodes, the storyboards nobody saw. There was a version of this series that ended abruptly and left the Pops plot unresolved forever, and the only reason it doesn't exist is that somebody asked a direct question and got a straight answer. The reason the final season is set in space is the title card. That's it. That's the whole reason. Quintel noticed at some point that the show's own title card had always been floating in space. It just sits there in the black, has done since the beginning, and decided that sending the park up there would bring the thing full circle. Which is a lovely bit of reasoning, and also completely mad. Most shows decide on a final arc based on character, or theme, or where the story needs to end. This one looked at its own logo and went, well, we've been in space the whole time, we may as well go. That same season is also where the show quietly stops being purely episodic and commits to an actual plot. Pops, his brother, the fate of the universe, which is a big swerve for a series whose entire identity was that nothing important happens here. It works better than it should, mostly because the groundwork had been going in for years. Pops had a difficult father, a strange origin, and a lot of small sad moments, long before anyone knew he was going to matter. The resolution is odd in a way I still like. He doesn't beat his brother, he hugs him and flies into the sun with him, and everyone else's deaths get reversed. A children's cartoon settling its apocalypse by having the nicest character decline to fight. And that season closes on a shot of Pops watching the show he was in, on a VCR, which is the thing that made a revival possible much later on, though I don't think anyone in 2017 meant it that way. It reads as a full stop. That the door turned out to be a door anyway is just a nice bit of luck. The finale itself is stacked with references to the show's own beginnings, and the biggest one is the Naive Man clip. Pops walks through a piece of Quintel's original student film, the one where the character came from, and encounters a sketched, earlier version of himself. He tries to interact with the other characters, realises he can't, and goes back to fight his brother. That is a fairly extraordinary thing to put in a season finale on a children's network. A character walking through the art school project he was born in. And it goes further. The other inhabitants of Lollyland in that sequence, Frivola Cranus, Quadravi Cranus, and a character generally just called Weird Mushroom Guy, are all earlier discarded drawings of Pops, which is why they all look faintly like him. They're not his species so much as his drafts. Mordecai's wife, Steph, is a good example of how loose some of this stuff was. She isn't named on screen, she was just Mordecai's wife. The name came later, during a Reddit AMA, when writer Matt Price came up with it on the spot, and picked Steph because Quintel loves the Goonies. So one of the most discussed characters in the finale got named after the fact in a comment thread, because of a 1985 film. Price also went on record about why Mordecai doesn't end up with Margaret or CJ, which was the single most argued about thing in the fanbase for years. His explanation was straightforward. They felt the story was finished, both women were already on their own paths, and Mordecai had genuinely moved on. He'd left the park to pursue art, so it made sense he'd meet someone doing that. And he added, fairly bluntly, that Mordecai had been too wishy-washy with both of them anyway. He's not wrong, he was. Price also gave out their fates. Margaret still keeps in touch with Mordecai, Rigby, and Eileen, and is travelling the world as a newswoman. CJ became a professional dodgeball player and doesn't talk to any of them anymore, which is both an extremely funny career and, if you think about it for a second, quite a sad ending. She just left. And I'll be honest, I've never fully made peace with that one. Not because it's wrong, people do drift out of each other's lives entirely, and it's realistic, but because it's delivered in a Reddit comment years later, rather than in the show. There's something a bit odd about finding out a character's whole future in a thread. Right, a couple of things about the show's actual place in the world. Excellent is the episode that won regular show its Emmy, which is pleasing because it's an episode about a man eating a very large omelette to win a hat. And the challenge in it is real. The 12-egg omelette challenge is based on an actual challenge at a restaurant in California. That whole absurd premise is just something that exists, out in the world, that somebody has presumably attempted while sober. The traffic went the other way too. A company made a real-life version of the ultimatum, the ridiculous stacked sandwich from the show, and cited regular show as the inspiration. So a fictional food became real, and a real challenge became fiction in the same series. Now, the less cheerful part. The show got treated fairly badly by its own network towards the end. Season 1 more or less vanished from the schedule after 2014. By 2016, the show was airing at 6:30 in the morning. The final stretch of episodes was burned off weekly, with barely any promotion, usually right after a marathon of something else. The finale aired once, exactly once, and then the show disappeared from the schedule entirely. No reruns, no marathon, nothing. That still annoys me if I'm honest. Not on any grand principle, just on a practical level. People who missed it that evening had nowhere to go. For a series that had been one of the network's flagship shows for years, it's a strange way to be shown the door. Halloween reruns of the Terror Tales specials became a small annual tradition for a few years, which was nice, right up until 2020, when they were scheduled and then replaced at the last minute with something else. And in the US, only 3 seasons ever got proper DVD box sets. 5 seasons of a very popular show simply never got a physical release, which is the sort of thing that used to bother me a great deal more before everything ended up on streaming anyway. One last thing, because it's the most persistent myth about this show, and it's worth clearing up. There's a widely believed story that regular show was originally developed for Adult Swim and only landed on Cartoon Network because of scheduling, which is how people explain The Edge in the early seasons. That isn't true. It was always in development for daytime. The adult flavour came from Cartoon Network, deliberately experimenting with the TV PG rating at that moment, which you can see across the other Cartoon Institute pilots from the same period. The show wasn't smuggled in, it was commissioned on purpose by people who wanted exactly that, which I think is a better story than the myth, personally. Somebody at a children's network deliberately backed this is more interesting than somebody wasn't paying attention. There's a bit of context that makes the network situation more understandable, if not much better. Around the mid-2010s, the schedule was heavily dominated by one particular show, and everything else got squeezed. Adventure Time went through much the same thing at much the same time. It's not that anyone at the network decided regular show had gone bad, it's just that it was, by television standards, old. It premiered in 2010. By 2016, that's ancient for a kids' network, with a constant intake of new viewers. There was a brief period in late 2015 where things looked like they'd recovered. The show got its 7:30 slot back, Adventure Time reruns returned, and for a moment the afternoon looked like it had, in the good years. It didn't last. By early 2016, the block that had been created for both shows quietly disappeared. The thing that always struck me is the marathon situation. The final proper regular show marathon aired a few weeks before the last season started. Once season 8 was on, the earlier seasons vanished from rotation entirely. So the show's final run went out with no supporting reruns to an audience who couldn't easily go back and check what any of the callbacks referred to. For a series this dense with its own history, that's a genuinely unhelpful way to air it. Still, none of that really touched what the show left behind, which is the bit I'd rather end on. The show's influence is fairly easy to trace forward. If you look at what came after it, Pickle and Peanut, Apple and Onion, Smiling Friends, you can see the shape of it. Two mismatched mates, a low-stakes premise, and a willingness to let a scene get genuinely strange without explaining itself. And backwards, its own influences are pretty clearly Bill and Ted, The Simpsons, Beavis and Butthead, Rocko's Modern Life, and The Mighty Boosh. That last one is the interesting inclusion, because the Boosh connection explains a lot about the show's particular flavour of surrealism, the deadpan delivery of completely mad things, which is a much more British instinct than an American one. Which might be why the show plays so well outside the States, despite being so specifically Californian underneath. One last note before the end of this lot, and it's about the show's own self-image. Regular Show was always faintly aware of being a show. The tagline played on the idea that it wasn't a regular show at all. The final battle features a character walking through his own creator's student film. The 8th season exists because of a logo. That's a lot of navel-gazing for a cartoon, and it should be insufferable. The reason it isn't is that the show never treats any of it as clever. Pops does have a moment of realization about the nature of his own existence. He looks at a drawing of himself, is briefly confused, and then gets on with saving everyone, because that's what needs doing. Which is, in the end, the same joke the show had been telling since the first episode. Something impossible happens, everyone reacts to it like it's a mild inconvenience, and then they go and have lunch. So that's where it sat for a long time. Finished, off the air, quietly enormous, on streaming, and not coming back. Except it did. It was announced at the Annecy Animation Festival back in 2024, which is a very film festival way to announce a cartoon about two blokes who won't rake leaves. Quintel had been at Cartoon Network Studios, working on something else entirely, when he got asked whether he fancied bringing it back, and evidently he did. Regular Show, The Lost Tapes turned up on Cartoon Network on the 11th of May, 2026, with a half-hour special, and the framing device is genuinely clever. Pops is in the afterlife, where he's been watching a VHS of his own memories, which is where the new special imagines him, even though the original finale left him sacrificing himself to save the universe. He wears the tape out, goes looking for more, and finds a whole warehouse of them, so every new episode is technically a lost memory, which means they can slot in anywhere across the original run without touching the ending, and the ending stays exactly as it was. 10 episodes went out that May, with around 30 more ordered on top. The full original cast came back: Quintel, Salyers, Marin and Haddad Tompkins, with others like Hamill appearing only in archival or special spots. Same voices, same room presumably. And the thing I keep coming back to is that a show built almost entirely out of hidden references now has a completely fresh surface to hide things under. A whole gap in the middle to fill in. A whole new set of people on staff with their own favourite films and their own obscure consoles they're annoyed nobody remembers. Worth saying as well, the revival has landed better than most of these things do. It came out around the same time as a run of other nostalgia projects, and a fair bit of the commentary at the time was fairly weary about the whole trend. The general read on The Lost Tapes was that it makes almost no tonal, visual or narrative changes at all, which some people found underwhelming, and which I'd argue is precisely the point. Nobody wanted a reinvention. The show was already the shape it needed to be. It did well enough on the network that a batch went to streaming within a month of airing, which is quick. And it's a strange thing, honestly, to have spent a couple of hours going through everything a show hid in its background, and then to realise the whole exercise is now open-ended again. All of this was a closed set for 9 years, a finished thing you could go through exhaustively. Now it still is. Somebody's already put something in the background of one of those episodes that nobody's spotted yet. That's just how this show works. I'll probably do a video on those at some point, once enough of them have aired and people have had a proper dig. Anyway, that's the 100. Sleep